2 weeks after my wife left to visit our daughter, I decided to surprise them. But when I reached their house, a man sprinted toward me shouting, "Stop." What he said next made my heart freeze, and minutes later, police cars flooded the street. Before I continue, tap subscribe and comment where you're watching from. You know, there are moments in life when everything you believed about the people you love just shatters. When the foundation you built your entire world on crumbles beneath your feet like sand. When you realize that the blood running through your veins might as well be poison, because the people who share it have become strangers capable of unthinkable evil. That's where I'm standing right now. In the wreckage of what I thought was my family. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you feel grateful to be alive. My wife Vivian had been visiting our daughter Sarah for what was supposed to be a week-long trip. Mother-daughter bonding time, she called it. Sarah had been going through some rough patches with her marriage, and Vivian wanted to be there for her. I supported it completely. Hell, I encouraged it. After 30 years of marriage, I thought I knew my wife's heart better than my own. She was the kind of woman who would give you the shirt off her back, who would drive 3 hours in a snowstorm just to bring you soup when you were sick. The kind of mother who never stopped believing in her children, no matter how many times they disappointed her. God, was I wrong about everything? The drive to Sarah's house that Tuesday should have taken 4 hours. It took me nearly 6, because I kept stopping to rehearse what I was going to say when I walked through that door. I had this whole romantic speech planned out about how I missed her, how the house felt empty without her laugh echoing through the halls. I even stopped at that little flower shop she loves and bought her favorite roses, the deep red ones that smell like heaven and cost more than they should. I was going to sweep her off her feet like we were newlyweds again. I was going to remind her why we fell in love in the first place. I was going to hold her in my arms and tell her that whatever problems Sarah was having, we'd face them together, as a family. Christ, I was such a fool. The first red flag should have been the silence. Vivian always answered her phone. Always. In 30 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times she'd let my calls go to voicemail. But for the past 3 days, nothing. Radio silence. When I'd finally gotten through to Sarah, she'd been different. Distant. She kept saying Mom was resting, or out shopping, or some other excuse that felt rehearsed. And then there were those strange messages Sarah had been sending over the past few weeks. Casual mentions about updating the will and going through hard times financially. At the time, I thought she was just being practical, maybe even responsible for once in her life. Sarah had always been the dreamer in our family, the one who chased get-rich-quick schemes and borrowed money she never paid back. But looking back now, with the bitter taste of betrayal burning in my throat, I realized those messages weren't casual at all. They were reconnaissance. They were a predator circling its prey, figuring out exactly how much there was to steal. The drive felt endless, like I was traveling through some twisted version of purgatory where time moved differently. Every mile marker that passed felt like a small eternity. My hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tight, and there was this gnawing anxiety in my stomach that I couldn't shake. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can feel a storm coming hours before the first clouds appear. I tried calling again. Straight to voicemail. Vivian's voice, bright and cheerful, telling me to leave a message and she'd get back to me soon. That voice that used to be my comfort, my anchor in any storm, now felt like a ghost haunting me from beyond the grave. When I finally pulled into Sarah's driveway, the first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. It was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday, sure, but this wasn't normal quiet. This was the kind of heavy silence that settles over a place where something terrible has happened. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your heart race for reasons you can't quite name. The house looked normal enough from the outside. Sarah's little suburban dream home with its perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence. The American dream, wrapped up in vinyl siding and false promises. But there was something off about it, something that made me hesitate before I even got out of the car. Maybe it was the way all the curtains were drawn tight in the middle of the day. Maybe it was the fact that Vivian's car was nowhere to be seen, even though Sarah had told me she was there. Or maybe it was just that father's intuition that kicks in when something is threatening your family, even when you don't understand what that threat is yet. I walked up to the front door with those roses in my hand, feeling more nervous than I had in years. My finger hovered over the doorbell for a moment before I pressed it. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot in a cathedral. I waited. Nothing. I rang again, holding it longer this time. Still nothing. That's when I started to panic. Not the rational kind of worry that makes you check your phone or call someone. The primal, animal kind of panic that floods your system with adrenaline and makes your vision tunnel. Something was very, very wrong. I was about to try the door handle when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, urgent footsteps like someone running. I turned around to see a man I'd never met before sprinting across the street toward me. He was maybe 40, wearing jogging clothes, and his face was pale as death. "Sir," he shouted, waving his arms like he was trying to flag down a speeding car. "Sir, please stop." I stood there like a deer in headlights, clutching those stupid roses, watching this stranger run toward me with desperation written all over his face. When he reached me, he was breathing hard, doubled over with his hands on his knees. "Don't go in there," he gasped between breaths. "Please, there's something you need to know first." And that's when my world started to fall apart. The man straightened up, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was struggling with something, wrestling with whether to tell me whatever terrible truth he was carrying. His name was David, he told me. He lived across the street. He'd been Sarah's neighbor for 3 years. "Are you family?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm Sarah's father," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "My wife is supposed to be visiting." "Vivian. Is she?" David's face crumpled. Actually crumpled, like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it burst. And in that moment, before he said another word, I knew. I knew that whatever had happened in that house, my wife was at the center of it. "Sir," David said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think you need to sit down." But I couldn't sit down. I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. The roses fell from my hands and scattered across the concrete like drops of blood, and all I could do was stare at this stranger who was about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. "Tell me," I said. The words came out harsh, commanding. It was my prosecutor voice, the one I'd used in courtrooms for 3 decades when I was cross-examining witnesses who were trying to hide the truth. "Tell me right now." David looked toward the house, then back at me, then down at the ground. "Last Tuesday night," he began, "around 10 o'clock, I heard screaming. A woman screaming for help. It was coming from inside that house. The world started to spin. Last Tuesday. That was exactly 1 week ago. The day before Vivian stopped answering her phone. I called 911 immediately," David continued, his words hitting me like physical blows. "But by the time the police got here, everything had gone quiet. Your daughter came to the door, told them it was just a bad dream. A nightmare. She seemed calm. Too calm, if you know what I mean." I didn't know what he meant. I couldn't process what he was telling me. This was my daughter he was talking about. My little girl who used to crawl into bed with us during thunderstorms, who cried when she accidentally stepped on ants, who once spent her entire allowance buying food for stray cats. The paramedics came too, David said, and his voice was getting smaller, like he was afraid of his own words. They wheeled someone out on a stretcher. A woman. Older. Dark hair, about your wife's height. She was unconscious. The ground beneath my feet might as well have turned to quicksand. I was sinking, drowning in disbelief and terror and a rage so pure it felt like molten metal in my veins. Where did they take her? I demanded. Which hospital? I don't know, David said. I'm sorry, I should have followed up, but your daughter insisted everything was fine. She said her mother had just had a panic attack, that she was sensitive to new medications. She seemed so concerned, so worried about privacy. Of course she did. Of course Sarah had the perfect explanation ready. She'd always been a good liar, even as a child. I used to think it was creativity, imagination. Now I realized it was practice. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I started dialing hospitals, working my way through every emergency room in a 50-mile radius. Most of them couldn't tell me anything without proper identification, but I'd been a prosecutor for 30 years. I knew how to ask the right questions, how to find the cracks in bureaucratic walls. It took 47 minutes and 16 phone calls before I found her. Yes sir, the voice on the other end said, Vivian Morgan was admitted 8 days ago. Critical condition. Are you family? Critical condition. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My wife, the woman I'd loved for more than half my life, was fighting for her life in some hospital bed while I'd been sitting at home wondering why she wasn't returning my calls. I'm her husband, I said, surprised I could still form words. What happened to her? There was a pause. The kind of pause that comes before life-altering information. Sir, I think you need to speak with the attending physician. And probably the police. There's been some complications with her case. Complications. Police. My wife was dying, and there were complications that required police involvement. The prosecutor in me knew exactly what that meant, even though every other part of me was screaming in denial. Someone had tried to kill her. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I don't remember parking or walking through the automatic doors or asking for directions to the ICU. The next clear memory I have is standing in front of a detective named Lisa Thornton, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much evil in the world. Mr. Morgan, she said, I'm very sorry about your wife's condition. But I need to ask you some questions. Is she going to live? I asked. It was the only question that mattered. The doctors are cautiously optimistic, Detective Thornton said. But Mr. Morgan, your wife didn't have an accident. Someone poisoned her. Poisoned. The word hung in the air between us like a curse. Someone had deliberately, methodically tried to murder my wife. Someone had looked into her trusting eyes and fed her poison, then watched as her body shut down, system by system. Who? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Part of me had known from the moment David started talking, even though I'd refused to accept it. We're still investigating, Detective Thornton said carefully. But the poison was administered in her food during dinner last Tuesday evening. Cardiac medication, crushed up and mixed into what appears to have been her dessert. A massive overdose that should have killed her within hours. Should have killed her. My wife was supposed to be dead. Someone had calculated the dosage, planned the method, chosen the moment. Someone had sat across from her at a dinner table and watched her eat poison, knowing they were watching her last meal. I need to see her, I said. Detective Thornton nodded. Mr. Morgan, I have to tell you that your daughter and son-in-law have been uncooperative with our investigation. They've lawyered up, aren't answering questions. Given the circumstances, you need to be prepared for the possibility that That my own daughter tried to murder her mother, I finished. The words tasted like acid in my mouth. We walked through the sterile hospital corridors in silence. Each step felt like walking toward my own execution. I'd prosecuted dozens of attempted murder cases over the years. I'd sat across from killers and looked into their eyes, tried to understand what kind of darkness lived in souls capable of such acts. But I'd never imagined that same darkness might be growing in someone who shared my blood. The ICU was a maze of machines and monitors, all beeping and humming with the rhythm of life barely sustained. And there, in bed number 12, was my wife. My beautiful, trusting, loving wife, looking so small and fragile that I barely recognized her. Tubes ran down her throat and into her arms. Machines tracked her heartbeat, her breathing, her brain activity. Her face was pale as moonlight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a pain I couldn't even imagine. I pulled a chair up beside her bed and took her hand. It was cold, so much colder than it should have been. Her wedding ring looked too big now, like she was disappearing from inside her own skin. "I'm here, baby," I whispered, though I didn't know if she could hear me. "I'm here, and I'm going to make this right." That's when the rage really hit me. Not the quick flash of anger you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic or breaks something precious. This was different. This was the kind of rage that burns at the core of the earth, deep and hot and patient. The kind of rage that doesn't explode, it calculates. I'd been a prosecutor for 30 years. I'd sent murderers to death row and rapists to life sentences. I'd fought for justice in courtrooms across the state, and I'd won more cases than I'd lost. But I'd never wanted to destroy someone the way I wanted to destroy whoever had done this to my wife. And if that someone was my own daughter. God help me, but I'd still see justice done. I stayed with Vivian for 3 days, barely leaving her side except to shower and change clothes in the hospital's family facilities. The doctors said she was stable but still critical. The poison had damaged her heart, her kidneys, her liver. She was fighting for her life in ways I couldn't help with, battles being waged on a cellular level while I sat helplessly holding her hand. On the 4th day, she woke up. I was dozing in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed when I felt her fingers move in mine. My eyes snapped open, and there she was, looking back at me with those beautiful brown eyes I'd fallen in love with 3 decades ago. "Tom," she whispered, her voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed the day before. "I'm here," I said, fighting back tears. "I'm right here." She tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against the pillows. "What happened? Where am I? How do you tell the woman you love that her own daughter tried to kill her? How do you shatter what's left of someone's world when they're already broken and fighting just to stay alive?" "You're in the hospital," I said. "You've been sick. But you're going to be okay." Vivian studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. She'd always been able to read me like a book, and even drugged and traumatized, she could see I was hiding something. "Tom," she said, "tell me what really happened." So I did. I told her about the neighbor's call to 911, about the ambulance, about the poison. I watched her face change as the reality sank in, watched hope and confusion give way to horror and betrayal. "Sarah," she whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Vivian closed her eyes, and tears started streaming down her cheeks. Not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but the quiet, devastating tears of someone whose heart is breaking in real time. "I remember now," she said after a long moment. "Dinner. She made my favorite dessert. Chocolate mousse. I thought it tasted strange, bitter, but I ate it anyway because she'd worked so hard on it. And then she trailed off, lost in the memory. And then I started feeling dizzy. Sick. I asked to call you, but she said not to worry you. She said it was probably just something I ate, maybe food poisoning. She gave me some pills, said they'd help with the nausea. More poison. They'd given her more poison while she was already dying. I tried to get to my phone, Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. But Mark blocked the door. He just stood there, not saying anything, not letting me pass. And Sarah. Sarah just watched. She watched me collapse, watched me convulsing on the floor, and she did nothing. Mark. Sarah's husband. My son-in-law, who I'd walked down the aisle at their wedding 5 years ago. Who I'd lent money to when his business failed. Who I'd trusted with my daughter's happiness and my family's future. They were going to let me die, Vivian whispered. My own daughter was going to let me die on her kitchen floor. The machines around us beeped frantically as Vivian's heart rate spiked. A nurse rushed in, checking monitors and adjusting medications. I held my wife's hand and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. This wasn't just about attempted murder anymore. This was about the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about family, about love, about the people we trust with our hearts and our lives. But I was a prosecutor. I'd spent 3 decades learning how to turn pain into justice, how to channel grief into action. And if my own daughter thought she could get away with trying to murder her mother, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The next morning, I made a phone call to my old colleague, Detective Ray Harrison. Ray and I had worked together for 15 years before he transferred to the state police. If anyone could help me navigate the legal complexities of prosecuting my own family, it was him. Tom, Ray said when he answered, I heard about Vivian. Jesus, I'm so sorry. How is she? She's alive, I said. No thanks to our daughter. There was a pause. Ray had been to Sarah's wedding. He'd watched her grow up, had been there for her high school graduation party. This was as hard for him to process as it was for me. What do you need? He asked. Everything, I said. Financial records, phone records, computer searches, medical histories. I want to know every detail of what they planned and when they planned it. I want evidence that will put them away for the rest of their lives. Tom, Ray said carefully, you know you can't be involved in the prosecution, right? Conflict of interest. You'll have to step back and let someone else handle it. I know, I said. But I can damn sure make sure they have everything they need to get a conviction. Over the next 2 weeks, while Vivian slowly recovered in the hospital, I became a man obsessed. I hired a private investigator named Janet Cruz, a former cop who specialized in financial crimes. I reached out to every contact I'd made in 30 years of prosecution work. I called in favors, traded information, and built a case against my own daughter with the same methodical precision I'd once used to send strangers to prison. The picture that emerged was uglier than I'd ever imagined. Sarah and Mark were drowning in debt. Gambling debts, specifically. Mark had been betting on sports, losing consistently, borrowing money from increasingly dangerous people to cover his losses. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, maxed out on credit cards, and facing bankruptcy. But Sarah was the sole beneficiary of Vivian's life insurance policy. $800,000 that would solve all their problems if only Vivian was dead. The computer forensics were even more damning. Sarah's laptop showed searches for lethal dosage cardiac medication, how long for heart attack symptoms, and inheritance law. Mark's phone had calls to estate lawyers, asking about how quickly life insurance policies paid out after death. They'd been planning this for months. The medical evidence was the final nail in the coffin. Sarah had somehow obtained high-dose cardiac medication, the kind used in hospitals for severe heart conditions. The amount they'd given Vivian was enough to kill 3 people. She'd only survived because she'd thrown up most of her dinner, including much of the poisoned dessert. My daughter had tried to murder her mother for money. My son-in-law had helped, standing guard while the poison did its work. And when Vivian had collapsed, convulsing and dying on their kitchen floor, they'd stood there and watched, waiting for her to die so they could collect their blood money. But they hadn't counted on the neighbor calling 911. They hadn't planned for David's conscience, for his willingness to get involved when he heard someone screaming for help. And they certainly hadn't planned for their victim to survive and remember what they'd done. The arrest warrants were issued on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there when the police came for them. Detective Thornton thought it would be better if I kept my distance, and she was right. But Janet Cruz was watching from across the street, and she called me with the details. Sarah had screamed when they put the handcuffs on her. Actually screamed, like a child throwing a tantrum when they don't get their way. She demanded to know where I was, why I wasn't there to help her, why I was letting them treat her like a criminal. Because she was a criminal. She was a would-be murderer who tried to kill her own mother for money, and if that wasn't criminal, then the word had no meaning. Mark had gone quietly, his head down, already looking like the broken man he was about to become in prison. But Sarah had fought them every step of the way, proclaiming her innocence, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, insisting that someone had set her up. Even then, even with overwhelming evidence of her guilt, she was lying. Even facing life in prison, she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth or show even a hint of remorse for what she'd done. The media picked up the story within hours. Prosecutor's daughter charged in mother's poisoning. Family betrayal rocks legal community. Daughter allegedly poisoned mother for insurance money. The circus began immediately. Reporters camped outside the hospital, trying to get interviews with Vivian. They showed up at my house, at my office, at the courthouse where I'd worked for 3 decades. Everyone wanted to know how it felt to prosecute my own daughter, whether I'd seen signs of violence in her past, what I thought should happen to her. I said nothing. Vivian said nothing. We let our lawyers handle the media while we focused on healing and preparation for the trial that was coming. But Sarah and Mark, they sang like canaries to anyone who would listen. Their defense strategy became clear within days of their arrest. They were going to claim it was all an accident. A misunderstanding. Poor Sarah had been trying to help her mother with some heart palpitations, had gotten confused about dosages, had accidentally given her too much medication. The screaming the neighbor heard. Just Vivian having a panic attack. The refusal to call for help. They were trying to protect her privacy, keep her from being embarrassed by a mental health episode. It was bullshit, and we all knew it. But it was clever bullshit, the kind of story that might create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors who didn't want to believe a daughter could try to murder her mother. Worse, they started a public relations campaign. Photos of Sarah crying, looking young and innocent and devastated by the accusations. Interviews with Mark talking about how much they loved Vivian, how this was all a terrible mistake, how the real tragedy was that the family was being torn apart by false charges. They painted themselves as the victims. They actually had the audacity to suggest that Vivian and I were the cruel ones, that we were destroying an innocent young couple's life over a medical emergency. Some people believed them. Old friends started looking at me differently, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh, too quick to judge. Neighbors who'd known Sarah since she was a child couldn't reconcile the sweet girl they remembered with the calculated killer the evidence revealed. It was psychological warfare, and for a while, it was working. But then Detective Thornton and her team found the smoking gun. Mark's computer had more than internet searches. It had detailed notes about Vivian's schedule, her medication allergies, her health history. It had calculations about dosages and timing. And it had email exchanges with someone who'd helped them obtain the cardiac medication they'd used. Mark had a friend who worked at a hospital. A friend who'd been stealing drugs from the pharmacy and selling them on the side. A friend who'd provided the exact medication they'd needed to commit the perfect murder. When confronted with this evidence, Mark cracked. Completely fell apart in the interrogation room, crying and confessing and begging for a deal. He told them everything, how Sarah had come up with the plan, how they'd researched methods, how they'd practiced mixing the medication into different foods to make sure it would be undetectable. He told them about the night it happened, how Vivian had complimented the dessert even as it was killing her, how they'd sat there making small talk while the poison worked its way through her system. He told them about standing in front of the door, blocking her escape while she begged to call for help. And he told them about Sarah's reaction when the plan failed. How angry she'd been that Vivian had survived, how she'd wanted to try again, how she'd only agreed to the accident story when Mark threatened to confess everything if she didn't drop the idea of a second attempt. My daughter hadn't just tried to kill her mother once. She'd wanted to try again. Sarah's lawyers tried to claim that Mark was lying, that he was trying to save himself by blaming everything on her. But the evidence was overwhelming. The computer searches on her laptop, the financial motive, the insurance inquiries, it all painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer who'd been planning her mother's murder for months. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat in the gallery every day, watching my daughter lie under oath, watching her perform for the jury with fake tears and rehearsed emotion. She was good at it, better than most criminals I'd prosecuted over the years. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't seen the evidence, I might have believed her myself. But the jury saw through it. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Attempted murder in the first degree. Conspiracy to commit murder. Fraud. Sarah was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Mark, who'd cooperated with the prosecution, got 8 years. 15 years. It seemed like a lifetime and not nearly long enough at the same time. 15 years for trying to murder the woman who'd given her life, who'd raised her, who'd loved her unconditionally for 28 years. But you know what the worst part was? Even after the conviction, even after the sentencing, Sarah never showed an ounce of genuine remorse. No tears for her mother's pain, no apology for the betrayal, no acknowledgement of the evil she tried to commit. In her final statement to the court, she actually had the nerve to say that she hoped someday her parents would forgive her for the misunderstanding that had torn their family apart. Misunderstanding. She called attempted murder a misunderstanding. That night, after the sentencing, Vivian and I sat in our kitchen and rewrote our wills. Every penny we'd saved, every asset we'd accumulated, every dollar that would have gone to Sarah was redirected to charity. The woman who tried to kill her mother for money would never see a cent of our estate. We also changed the beneficiaries on our life insurance policies, removed Sarah from our emergency contacts, and made it clear in legal documents that she was no longer welcome in our home or our lives. People ask me if I regret it. If I feel guilty about cutting my daughter out of my life completely. If I think I should forgive her because she's family. Here's what I tell them: family isn't about blood. It's about love, trust, loyalty, and respect. It's about people who would die for you, not people who would kill you for money. Sarah stopped being my daughter the moment she put poison in her mother's food. She became a stranger, a criminal, a cautionary tale about what happens when greed and selfishness consume whatever decency might have once existed in someone's soul. Vivian is still recovering. Physically, she's doing well, the doctors say her heart function has improved, and most of the organ damage from the poison has healed. But emotionally, that's going to take a lot longer. She has nightmares about that night. She wakes up screaming sometimes, reliving the moment she realized her own daughter was trying to kill her. She's seeing a therapist, taking medication for anxiety and depression, working through the trauma of being betrayed by someone she trusted completely. But she's strong. Stronger than I ever realized. She survived a murder attempt through sheer force of will, and she's surviving the aftermath the same way. We're rebuilding our lives without Sarah and Mark in them. We're focusing on each other, on healing, on finding joy in small moments and simple pleasures. We're learning to trust again, though it's harder now, knowing how thoroughly someone we loved could deceive us. I retired from the prosecutor's office 6 months after the trial. 30 years of seeking justice for victims, and I'd never imagined I'd become a victim myself. But I'd also never imagined that the greatest evil I'd ever encounter would come from my own family. The house feels different now. Lighter in some ways, without the toxic presence of people who'd been planning our deaths while pretending to love us. But emptier too, because the daughter we thought we knew never really existed. The sweet, caring, loving girl we'd raised was just a mask worn by a killer. Sarah writes to us sometimes from prison. Letters full of self-pity and manipulation, asking for money for commissary, claiming she's found God, insisting that someday we'll understand it was all a mistake. We don't read them anymore. They go straight into the trash, along with every other reminder of the daughter who tried to murder her mother. Because that's the truth people don't want to face about evil. It doesn't always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it lives in your own home, sits at your dinner table, calls you mom and dad while planning your funeral. Sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones who share your blood. But here's what I've learned: you can't choose your blood relatives, but you can choose your family. And family, real family, is built on love and trust and mutual respect. It's people who celebrate your successes, comfort you in your failures, and would never, ever hurt you for their own gain. Cutting ties with toxic people isn't cruelty. It's survival. It's self-preservation. It's choosing to surround yourself with people who deserve your love instead of people who would abuse it. Vivian and I are going to be okay. We're survivors, both of us. We survived 30 years of marriage with all its ups and downs. We survived raising a child who turned into a killer. We survived a murder attempt that should have destroyed us. And we'll survive whatever comes next, because we have something Sarah and Mark never understood: we have real love, the kind that doesn't come with conditions or price tags or ulterior motives. The kind that doesn't measure its worth in insurance policies or inheritance checks. The kind that can't be poisoned, no matter how hard someone tries. So to anyone watching this who's dealing with toxic family members, who's struggling with people who claim to love you while treating you terribly, who's wondering if blood really is thicker than water, let me tell you something. Blood means nothing if it's mixed with poison. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who would hurt you, even if they share your DNA. Sometimes, especially if they share your DNA. Because in the end, we all deserve better than being someone else's victim. We all deserve to be surrounded by people who would protect us, not people who would destroy us for their own benefit. And if that means redefining what family means to you, if that means starting over with people who actually deserve your trust and love, then that's not betrayal. That's justice. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes, the most important conversations are the ones we're afraid to have. Sometimes, the truth hurts. But lies hurt more. And sometimes, survival means accepting that the people who should love you most are the ones capable of hurting you worst. But you don't have to let them. You never have to let them.